Private equity still makes us a little queasy, even though we've all come to terms with the fact that most public companies are run by arrogant, greedy bastards whose sole purpose is to extract as much value from the company as possible of what were once great businesses. But private equity, that's different. Private equity firms buy companies and take them private. They don't have to answer to shareholders. They don't have to file regular reports about their finances or operations. They can do whatever they want, which generally means pillaging the company's assets for personal gain. The fact that these firms use other people's money from pension funds, university endowments, Americans, and invest it in ways that benefit only themselves and their investors, is just an added bonus. Well, thanks to a new book by the journalist, we now know exactly how the entire system works and why private equity is still synonymous with the worst excesses of capitalism. So here are the 3 biggest takeaways from S' new book. The Great CEO Scam. Oh. Takeaway no. 1. The relationship between private equity firms and the companies they buy. Private equity firms seek out companies that produce steady cash flows. Basically companies that are UND, growing all that fast, but have a predictable revenue stream, because then they can use the cash flows from those businesses to pay themselves huge fees and give the investors in their funds exactly what they want: high yields with very little risk. Companies that are bought out by private equity firms often end up cutting costs, usually by laying off workers and raising prices, which makes the businesses more profitable, which in turn allows the private equity firm to pay itself more fees. And if that sounds like a bad deal for everyone except the private equity firm, well, that's because it is. In fact, according to a 2021 paper by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, companies bought by private equity firms experience slower growth, lower investment, and ultimately worse performance. Takeaway number 2. Private equity firms spend very little time worrying about the actual business they're supposed to be in. Instead, they focus almost all their efforts on extracting as much cash as possible from the business. And how do they do that? Well, one way is by loading up the company with debt. It is actually not uncommon for private equity firms to put very little of their own money into a company, instead borrowing most of the money they need to purchase the company, and then using the company's own cash flows to repay the loan. By its own estimates, nearly half of all leveraged buyouts in the US are done this way, meaning that the only real purpose of the private equity firm is to facilitate the transaction. They don't actually want to own or operate the business. They just want to profit from its eventual sale. Which brings us to takeaway no. 3. Private equity firms are really good at making themselves look like the good guys, even though they really just facilitate the transfer of wealth from workers, customers, and society as a whole. Part of the reason they're so good at this is because they spend very little time worrying about how their actions affect anyone except themselves. Thanks to the passage of the LBO loophole, the most important piece of legislation to pass in the last decade, private equity firms no longer need to disclose how much money they make. As a result, there's literally no way to know how much money private equity firms have made since the LBO was passed. But what we do know is that it's a lot. According to estimates, private equity firms have reaped nearly $1 trillion in profits since the LBO was passed in 2017. $1 trillion in less than a decade. So yeah, no wonder private equity still makes us queasy. This is your host. Thanks for watching.